Hello and welcome to a new episode of Black Hat Theology. This is Dr. Peter Dillard. I would like to extend a special greeting to those of you who've been following my lectures on YouTube and my YouTube channel. I appreciate your attention and I hope you found what I have to say here informative and instructive. It's been some time since I've uploaded any lectures to my YouTube channel because this summer, the summer of 2017, I've been very busy with a number of different projects in philosophical theology. So what I wanted to do today is give you some idea of what I've been working on. And in particular, I would like to foreshadow what I hope will be my next book project on possible connections between the philosophy of Martin Heidegger and contemporary theology. It's a sort of sequel to the last book that I wrote on that theme. One thing I've been working on this summer is a book review for the Heathbrooke Journal, in which I review a very fine anthology of essays by Oliver D. Crisp about the New England theologian Jonathan Edwards. Hopefully that review will be coming out soon in the Heathbrooke Journal, and you can see what I have to do there, but I will say out front that Crisp's book is an excellent piece of scholarship. It's an exemplary piece of how philosophical theology, in my opinion, should be done. So I highly recommend that work to you, and I hope that you will take a look at what I have to say about it. Another project that I've been working on this summer is a paper about the doctrine of predestination that's held by John Duns Scotus. Very briefly, Scotus's view is that although God predestines each and every member of the elect to eternal salvation, God does not predestine any member of the reprobate to damnation, so he avoids the kind of double predestination view that is often ascribed to John Calvin. So I've been working on a paper about that. I've received some very, very good referee comments, and hopefully that paper will be coming out later. I'll let you know as more details about that become available. But my main project right now has to do with my ongoing engagement with the philosophy of Martin Heidegger and its possible relevance to issues in contemporary theology, and particularly contemporary theology that considers itself non-metaphysical, at least in many respects. As you'll recall, in a number of my previous lectures, I discussed a version of theology that I believe can be developed on the basis of Heidegger's later philosophy, and that philosophy is a theology is a theology of Gelassenheit, where the leading idea of this theological approach is that our fundamental, or at least one very fundamental experience that we have when we encounter divinity is one of peaceful dwelling. And in my last book, I elaborated how I thought that kind of theological option might be developed in light of what Heidegger says in his later philosophy. But in that book, I also mentioned that there was another possibility, and that would be the possibility of a theology of Streit, or struggle. And according to this theological approach, our fundamental experience of divinity, or at least a very important experience that we have when we can encounter divinity, is one of struggling to wrest some kind of clarity from what is obscure, from what is hidden. We may even be wrestling with a kind of paradoxical God. Now, in my last book, I made a provisional decision to pursue the theology of Gelassenheit. But I also made it clear in that work that within this broader Heideggerian post-metaphysical theological framework that I am trying to develop throughout this portion of my career, my writing, I would also like to see a theology of Streit worked out and developed. I think that that would also be another useful tool for us to have in our theological toolbox. Now, what I want to say in this lecture, rather briefly, but hopefully in a way that will be engaging, is what are some of the reasons that we might want to develop this Streit theological option? I mentioned some things in the book, but I want to go beyond that a little bit and sort of give you a window onto what I've been thinking about over the last few weeks and months. Now, one reason that was made clear in the book, but that I should review briefly here, is that if we want to allow the faith the Christian faith, because I'm coming at this material from the perspective of a Christian and a Christian theologian, if we want the Christian faith not to be identified with any particular theology, and specifically not to be identified with Gelassenheit theology, it would behoove us to have available at least one other theological option within this Heideggerian framework. We want to avoid saying, well, look, in order to be a person of faith, you have to be a Gelassenheit theologian. We want to allow, if at least at all possible, our faith to have different modes of theological expression, not only so that we can avoid the mistake of collapsing faith into a particular theology, Heideggerian or otherwise, but also because it's very important for the framework that I'm trying to recommend to you here, that I am recommending to you here, this Heideggerian framework. It's important that we simply don't chisel things in stone and then everything is sort of cut and dried and that's it, and then we close the book and put it on the shelf and we don't think about it again. I'm really trying to spur and encourage ongoing debate within this framework. That is in no way meant to foreclose on the possibility of doing theology in some other way or other ways. I myself have done that. I know many friends and people in the discipline who've done an excellent job coming at this material, the faith, what we believe from different perspectives, even metaphysical ones, that's fine. But if I'm going to make a contribution here, I feel that it's very important for me to give us not simply some idol, a statue that, well, this is what Dillard thinks about Heidegger and later theology, and there it is. I want you to take something away from this, hopefully, that will encourage you to find your own ways of contributing creatively within this particular framework that I am trying to set forth, not just for myself, but for my colleagues and other interested parties. So that was something that I talked about in the last book. Now, there's another thing, though. There's another reason, it seems to me, as I reflect upon the matter, in which we might be motivated, at least to consider very seriously, the prospect of a Streit theology. So in order to make this second reason clear, let's go back to the basic outline or the basic shape of the Gelassenheit theology that I set forth in non-metaphysical theology after Heidegger, the last book. Now, remember that a very important part of that, first of all, there's a proto-theology that's common to Streit theology, if there were to be such an alternative theology. There's this kind of proto-theology according to which God is not a particular being, nor is he the non-metaphysical event of being, but he is a kind of holy non-being that hopefully can guide us to make decisions under its influence. And I've devoted a considerable amount of time to discussing that in the book and also to presenting it in my previous lecture. So I'm not going to go over that part of it. But remember that the basic idea, when we get to the point where we want to make decisions under the aegis, if you will, of the holy, or under the guidance of this holy presence, this non-being that's still something real, it purports to be real, something out there, which can be an intentional correlate of our experiences and can have a profound influence upon us. There's a certain process of decision-making that I described in the book that I want to very briefly summarize here again. And so remember that one aspect of this is the situation of thoughtful openness. Now, according to the Gelassenheit theology, who draws upon Heidegger's later theology in order to develop this theological option, when Heidegger is talking about struggle, for the Gelassenheit theology, that pertains primarily to the struggle to free ourselves from metaphysical and other kinds of philosophical confusion that blinker or interfere with our proper understanding, to the extent that we can reach one, of God, of the holy. And so the struggle between world and earth, between obscurity and clarity, trying to wrest disclosure from what is concealed, all that rhetoric in Heidegger, according to the Gelassenheit theologian, that pertains to trying to reach this state of thoughtful openness where we are relatively free from confusions that are hamstringing our understanding of divinity. Okay, so there's this situation of thoughtful openness. Now, Another component of the decision process, the process of decision making according to the Gelassenheit theologian, is that when we're in this state of thoughtful openness, which could either be reached through a struggle, or we may just be innocent, we may be fortunate enough to find ourselves in that situation. But often now, especially in our modern contemporary society, we really do have to work at that, right, in order to deactivate the philosophical or metaphysical conundrums that are short-circuiting our encounter with divinity. Once we get to that state of thoughtful openness, there's what I call a Trakl clock, inspired by some of the things that Heidegger said about Georg Trakl, the great poet, the great German poet. And a Trakl clock is a relatively stable being, a thing. It could be a person. It could also be a poetic figure, something that we can come back to over and over again, something that we can revisit in our life. It's a kind of existential clock whereby we can become aware of changes, actual changes that have transpired in our lives since the last time we interacted with the Trakl clock, and we can also become aware or cognizant of possible changes, things that could happen differently in the future as we move on from this encounter with the Trakl clock. So we become aware of these actual and possible changes. Then, once that happens, there's what I call an aspect of Hölderlin spatiality. Here I'm inspired or guided by Heidegger's, some of his remarks about the great German poet Friedrich Hölderlin, especially when he's talking about the blue expanse of the sky and things like that, where we have this kind of sort of not totally disconnected, but a kind of general perception of spatiality where we're not absorbed in any particular project or activity or goal-oriented activity, but we sort of step back and are kind of aware of the space in which we pursue all these projects without being particularly engaged in anyone. And so there's a kind of reflective distance, as I described it in the book. Now, once that happens, then, since we're in this reflective distance, this kind of Hölderlin spatiality, we can then hold up these changes of which we've become aware which we've become aware through the Trakl clock for a decision, hopefully guided by the holy, where the way that decision falls out makes crucial use of these two aspects of the holy. On the one hand, there's a kind of holy, for the Gelassenheit experience. Remember, for the Gelassenheit theologian, our experience of God is one of Gelassenheit, that's letting be. It's a kind of energized tranquility. So already there we see that there are these two notes within the Gelassenheit experience, tranquility and energy. And what we want to have ideally when we think about a change of which we become aware in the Trakl clock and of which we're holding up for decision in this kind of reflective spatiality, we want total Gelassenheit. In other words, if reflecting on that change, if when we do that, we feel not only tranquility but energy, then that is a very powerful sign, I suggested, that we should embrace that change. If we have tranquility without energy, which is a kind of blasé boredom, if it goes on for a while, or if we have energy, agitation without peace, tranquility, then that's a sign that the change should be rejected. That's the Holy's way, the Gelassenheit Holy's way, of telling us that, well, let's not embrace that change if we feel in one of those ways. Or if we don't feel anything, then maybe, or in all likelihood, our reaction to the change of which we become aware should be one of indifference. So that's very roughly the kind of decision-making under the influence of the holy that I described in my book, the last book on Heidegger. It's a kind of phenomenology of the holy that sort of tries to unpack this Gelassenheit experience, this encounter with the holy, as peaceful tranquility that pervades our lives, and trying to unpack that in a way that can make it relevant, that can integrate it into human agency. Now, where does Streit theology come in here? Something very interesting about this has occurred to me. And if we look at this description of the decision-making process, notice that the way the Gelassenheit theologian has it, it's that, well, we sort of have an almost immediate access to the holy as this kind of experience of Gelassenheit. It's just like there. It's like almost directly accessible, or if not directly accessible, all we need to do or to have happen to us in order for it to become accessible is to achieve a situation or to enter into a situation of thoughtful openness, perhaps through some kind of deconstructive analysis or maybe through some kind of innocence or whatever, as the case may be. But that's all. And it sounds like pretty straightforward. Now, it seems to me the Streit theologian, especially if the Streit theologian is being guided by the Christian faith, is going to be rather skeptical about that. Why should we assume that the holy is so easily accessible to us? How does that happen? How does that happen? And in particular, when we turn to Heidegger's Beiträge zur Philosophie, the contributions to philosophy, this kind of philosophical diary or Tagebuch, a book of Denkbuch, book of philosophical thoughts. When we look at that, we see Heidegger saying something very different. Remember the basic narrative that he sets forth in that book. There are two possible advents. Right now we find ourselves in this metaphysical age where there's a plight and we don't have this sort of non-metaphysical understanding of the world. And so one possible advent is that we could undergo a transformation in which we enter into this radically post-metaphysical way of being and thinking that's imbued or infused with the non-metaphysical event of being, as he calls it. But that's only one advent. That's only the first part of the narrative. That then sets up the possibility for another advent, and that is the advent of what Heidegger calls the last God. Or more precisely, in the Beiträge, he says, what happens is that once we undergo the transformation to the other beginning, this non-metaphysical way of thinking and being, then that makes possible the decision either about the last God, and this decision will either result in the absconding or the remaining hidden or absent of the last God, or it will result in the appearance or the passing by of the last God. There will be a theophany, right? So once we've undergone the first transformation and entered into the non-metaphysical event of the holy, then the second advent of the last God may or may not happen. There may be an absconding of the last God, or the last God may pass by in this powerful way. And so Heidegger says we have to make a decision about that. He's very specific about that in the contributions at various places, which I have been studying this summer. Now, let's think about that in connection with Gelassenheit theology. Here, the cart is placed before the horse, or it's, as they would say in German, die Situation ist umgekehrt. Here it's not that, we have this access to the holy in some form, and then we can make holy decisions. No, Heidegger says in the Beiträge. It's the other way around. Es ist umgekehrt. Because before the last God might pass us by, before there could be any epiphany or theophany of the last God, we have to make a decision. After we've entered into this radically non-metaphysical era, or situation, if you will, of being. So, if that's the case, then, and the Streit theologian, it seems to me, is going to be more drawn to Heidegger's thinking and contributions than, say, in later works like The Thing and, what's the other one? The Thing, and sometimes in The Origin of the Work of Art, but especially The Thing, where he talks about the fourfold dwelling of earth, sky, divinities, and mortals. That's very much Gelassenheit, right? Or the dialogue on the country path, or those kinds of things where Heidegger's very much interested in this experience of letting be, the phenomenon of Gelassenheit. Streit theologians is going to seem to me be drawn to this more angespannt situation, this sort of tense situation where, look, we've entered into this non-metaphysical situation, but now we've got to make a decision, and only then can the holy become apparent to us. Even then, it's not guaranteed. But then it becomes possible. So then the decision precedes our phenomenological access to the holy, not the other way around, the way the Gelassenheit theologian has it. which is that, well, somehow, once we've done deconstruction, oh, now we have access to the holy through this experience of Gelassenheit, and now we can make decisions. The Streit theologian challenges that directly. And that is a matter that I want to think more about as I continue to execute this project, this new book project. That's something that's very much engaged me over the last few weeks and months of this summer. And finally, let me add that from a Christian perspective, especially where human beings find themselves, at least initially, in a state of original sin, or however we want to understand that, they are cut off from divinity in an important way. People like Luther would be very adamant about this, that original sin, whatever that is, however we want to understand or try to understand that in this Heideggerian context, that can interfere with reason or this kind of deconstructive analysis, or why can't it? Why should we assume that sin, original sin, in some form has not cut us off from the very experience of divinity that the Gelassenheit theologian thinks we need in order to make decisions under the proper guidance of the holy? That is something, it seems to me, that the Streit theologian will also try to press against her or his Gelassenheit opponent. And it's something that I want to explore more in this work, and I am exploring more in this work that I'm currently undertaking. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about, and as I hopefully continue to make progress on them, I will share more of these insights with you. I really want to work up a book proposal and then the book itself before I plunge headlong into another lecture series, but I think it's important to give you, I hope you'll find it interesting, to give you a kind of window on what I've been thinking about so that you can see the kinds of issues that somebody in this sort of Heideggerian, from this Heideggerian perspective, or who takes it seriously at least, someone is going to take seriously. What is the person thinking about? What kinds of questions might come out there, and how might we continue to advance this framework in a way that facilitates not just lectures from me, Peter Dillard, but your own contributions or your own insights that you can develop within the framework that I've set forth, using some of the tools that I've set forth. And no doubt there are mistakes there, but the emphasis right now is on ongoing dialogue. So with that, I want to conclude for today. Thank you very much for your Aufmerksamkeit, your attention. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section on my YouTube channel. But until next time, this is Dr. Peter Dillard signing off for Black Cat Theology. Thank you.